All right, good afternoon. We'll get started.
8 million of them had COVID.
Welcome.
So
First thing I'm going to ask us to do,
still 200.
Yeah, 8 months.
is
Yeah.
just take a moment, take a big deep breath in, and just exhale. Relax a little bit. Set your intention for today as related to learning and what state you want to be in, 3, 4, right? And we all talked about that. And then we're going to get rolling. Today, the team and I have been talking about how do we connect you with important people in the community, people who are making a difference. And we didn't want to just have this style where they come in and talk about their jobs. And so we're like, how do we pair that with issues that are important to America and this community and that? So it seems appropriate with 6 days before the election, 5 days, that we talk about politics and divide in America. So the two guests that we have today are going to help us make some sense of that. Before we get started, this is the first time I think we've had guests here for this cohort of students. We do what we call the big way. Typically, after somebody speaks, we applaud, sometimes give them a standing ovation. We do it in reverse here. So as soon as I finish my introduction, introduce these two gentlemen, our job is to stand up and give them a loud, raucous, standing ovation. Right? So we want to send them lots of positive energy, make them feel welcome. Got it? So you know what to do? All right. Again, as I mentioned, we want to talk about important topics. We want to tie this to Agile Seminar. While these gentlemen are going to display all the values that we've talked about and that we put on your map, in particular today, I think you're going to see leadership, responsibility, authenticity, community, and appreciation of humanity values really on display. So we're going to be paying attention to that. So today's conversation is not about Republicans and Democrats, who's right, who's wrong. We're not going there. This conversation is about why is our country so divided? Why is it so hard to have conversations with people that have different beliefs than us? And how might we help move this country towards a more civil conversation about our differences? I'm really excited to introduce these two gentlemen. They're community leaders, public servants. They both are currently or have served in different political offices that they'll talk about. Most important, they're incredibly decent, respectful, caring people that I have deep respect for. I told the morning group that if either one of these guys ran for mayor, they got my vote, no question asked. So I'm excited today to introduce to you Ron Corbett and Ben Rogers. All right, we're going to work on that.
It was pretty pathetic.
All right. All right, thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Just to give the kids a sense, can you just briefly share your resume, primarily focused on community service in your political lives? And Ron, would you like to start?
I'll go first. Yeah, my name is Ron Corbett, and I live here in Cedar Rapids. Have 5 kids that graduated from Washington High School over the years. My current position is with the Cedar Rapids Metro Economic Alliance, and that's a really long name, but we're the Chamber of Commerce business organization. My primary focus in my role that I'm in now is helping local businesses expand and grow from an economic standpoint. I've been involved in this community ever since I graduated from Cornell College over in Mount Vernon, 1983. I first ran for public office when I was 25 years old. So green behind the ears, didn't know what I was doing. But in Iowa at the time, we were going through a farm crisis and the economy was really struggling. A lot of young kids, when they were graduating from college and high school, couldn't find jobs, so they left the state. Iowa lost 300,000 people in the decade of the 80s. We had 3 million people in 1980, and we didn't get all that population back. Took us till 2010. So we lost almost a whole generation of people. Anyway, I decided to stay in Iowa and run for office. So my campaign theme was a young Iowan staying in Iowa. And it struck a tone with the voters in my district, and they elected me. I was one of only 2 or 3 people out of the 100 legislators in Des Moines that were under the age of 40. So I really did feel a little bit like a misfit. But I worked my way up through the system, so to speak, and had various leadership roles, including Speaker of the House, which is elected by the legislative body. I was 34 years old, youngest speaker in the history of Iowa, and that still stands to this day. But as my family grew, it was really tough to have a political life in Des Moines and travel the state. So in '99, I left the legislature to work full-time again in Cedar Rapids for the Chamber of Commerce. And then I also had some other business roles at CRST, which is a large trucking company in Cedar Rapids. And then in 2009, after the flood of 2008, I decided to get back into public life and ran for mayor and served for 8 years, which is 2 terms as mayor. And then in 2017, I retired from public office. I believe in term limits and thought it was a chance now to give some new people opportunity to lead and run the city. So for the last 2 years, I've been at the Cedar Rapids Metro Economic Alliance.
And my name is Ben Rogers. I'm on the Lynn County Board of Supervisors. I was born and raised here in Cedar Rapids, and then at the age of 10, which was 1990, my family and I moved to New Zealand, where we lived for 4 years, and that was a real formidable time in our lives. The day after we moved back here, I started my freshman year at Wash. Like I told the last class, I wanted to really spread my wings once I graduated, so I went to Iowa City. And then after Iowa City, I was like, how far away from here can I get? And the answer was 13 miles. So I ended up in Mount Vernon. I was a volunteer firefighter, and I also worked at 4 Oaks at it's called a PMIC unit, a Psychiatric Medical Institute for Children. I worked with children between the ages of 6 and 12 who all had an array of behavioral disorders that, due to physical, sexual, emotional abuse, or drug addiction while in utero, that led them to not be successful at home or in school situations. And that really was my first encounter with how social and human services are delivered and how impactful those services can be. And that ultimately, years down the line, really attracted me to the county. The county system of government is probably the least understood. I think some people can kind of conceptually understand what a city council does. They kind of get what a state legislature does, but they don't understand really what's in the middle. So we're the layer of government that provides mental health, substance use disorder treatment, helping out for veterans, helping people who have difficulty helping themselves, so helping rent assistance, utility assistance, transportation, helping people who have disabilities get to and from work. And so that's really the bread and butter of what we do. And I ran for office when I was 28, and that was in 2008. And I ran, similar to one of the reasons or observations that Ron made, is that there was no one in elected office in the city, the county, or really even in the state legislature who looked like me and was my age. And so if decisions are made by those who show up, it's important. That doesn't mean you have to run for office, but it does mean that you have to have some skin in the game. And so I decided the skin in the game for me was I wanted to run, and have been in that office since I was sworn in 2009. And I've worked a lot, extensively on mental health and disability issues. I'm really proud that next month, Lynn County will have one of the first and largest, it's called a Mental Health Access Center. It's a place where people who are having a mental health challenge can go. Instead of 2 of the most often sought out forms of treatment are the hospital, emergency rooms, or jail. And we don't have any detox beds in this community, so there will be detox beds for people to detox off of alcohol and other substances. This is in 1 unit, so it's probably the most impactful thing I've ever worked on in my life, and really, really excited. That's sort of the power of when government, who provides human services, really coordinates with other entities, kind of the power that you can change lives in this community. So it feels good. I just thought I'd in case anyone had ever heard of the Mental Health Access Center, I just want to give it some context.
Yeah, thank you. I probably failed to mention, I selected these two gentlemen because for all the reasons I stated, and they come from different political viewpoints. So let's just jump right in. I think my first question is, all of us see the anger and the division and the vitriol going on in the commercials and everywhere, Facebook, everywhere we go. From your guys' perspective and experience, has it always been this contentious between the parties? And if not, what are the factors that have made this seemingly worse than when I was young and when you were in the legislature, that kind of thing?
I mean, I don't know what phenomena we want to talk about as it relates to politics. Certainly in the last 20 years or in your lifetimes, the game has changed. Internet, the rise of the internet. Certainly back when I was in high school and when I graduated in '98, no one had cell phones. The internet was not really an accessible thing. And so the rise of the internet, the proliferation of social media, and how information is disseminated instantly, where people can post anonymously or blast it out to their networks. And then it's I think the toxicity and the vitriol and the anger really comes from, I think, one of the major tributaries is a ton of money entering into a system where people, the way to win often, or the way that we allow the system to operate, is that they have to cut each other down in order to get their point across, which is why you see a lot of the negative ads. So when I talk about money, there was a Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United that essentially said companies are people, and people have First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, therefore they can give unlimited amounts of money to political action committees or other organizations. That's why you see ads just the airwaves being flooded. And that wasn't the case 20 years ago. What you're seeing today in modern times is not normal. There have always been disagreements. There's always been really contentious times in our histories, but this is a different breed.
Yeah, I don't like the direction that we've been going over the last 20 years, but I would concur with Ben. There is a lot of money in the system. Remember, all these ads that you see on TV or hear on the radio or on your device, Pandora, whatever social media that you're on, all these ads are normally designed to persuade us or bias us towards, one candidate or the other. It's really the only industry that takes this cutthroat approach towards individuals and gets personal. I mean, take all the political ads aside. If you see an ad or hear an ad from McGrath Auto doesn't say in their ad, Randy Kuehl cars are pieces of crap, don't buy any of those.
Kind of wish
and
they
Randy Kuehl doesn't say, and they're going to try to screw you if you buy a car from McGrath. I mean, they compete on price, customer service, as we mostly see in the private sector, but politics has become very, very demeaning, unfortunately. And there is a lot of anger from citizens that, I hear people say, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. But I also see elected officials, instead of calming people down, it's okay to be upset. I know you don't like the direction of the way this issue is going, but they encourage it then and say you should be mad as hell. And if you're not, something's wrong with you. You need to be mad. And so now I used to use this term as mayor. My goal was to keep the passivity level down. So it's a word, you ever heard the term pissed off? Someone's mad, they're pissed off. Well, go on Urban Dictionary and it explains passivity. So keep the passivity level down, you can get more accomplished. Because when people are emotional and they're mad and upset for whatever, just think maybe just recently for us, the derecho and the trees on the street and everything, a lot of people were expressing their anger, their displeasure of the city not doing things fast enough, and they did it through anger. And so the passivity level is really high in our country, and part of that is citizens, we allow it to trigger those emotions, and a big part of it is elected officials that encourage it.
And there's also something really interesting about American politics. This is one of the few democracies in the world, if not maybe the only, where presidential campaigns basically start the minute the previous election stops. So next Wednesday is when I am sure candidates are going to start then coming to Iowa, and they're plotting 4 years ahead, right? And certainly we've experienced, because of the primaries and the caucuses the last 2 years, there's this whole process, like in New Zealand or in Great Britain or in Europe. They have many of them have parliamentary systems, and when elections are called, it's generally like 30 to 60 days later. Not 2 years, 3 years, where this just drags. It is, here is the election, here's the amount of money that can be spent, it's regulated to a certain degree, and then elections happen. What's also really interesting internationally, and I think maybe one of the genesis is why you have two representatives from different parties here, is coalition governments. We don't have that in the United States. And some other countries, they need lower or minority political parties, small political parties, to help form a government if one of the parties doesn't have a majority. In the United States, what you're really seeing are two one-party nation versus one two-party nations. And I think those semantics matter. And you're seeing the polarization to both ends of the spectrum, and it's disenfranchising out the middle. They're both parties, Democrats and Republicans, are guilty of this, of sort of purging out the moderates. And they're making it a zero-sum game where it's, if I vote on your bill in support, my party will punish me for supporting him. And likewise, there's a punishment mechanism for that. You don't really necessarily see that in other countries that have coalition governments or more than just two major parties. And I think what we're really seeing is that we are a two-party country in how we respond and react to major issues.
One of the, both in that question, you both mentioned the influence of PAC and lots of money, and we don't see much compromise. What happened to you talked a little bit about the punishment, but what does it cost us when we can't have legislators who can come together and solve problems, and they have to? Why does it work that way? How does it work?
Well, where it costs us in the long run is public policy then may not be sustainable. And sustainability is a popular word that people use on a lot of fronts, but public policy is another way to do that. So one president comes in and they sign a bunch of executive orders. And then on day one of the next president's term, they reverse all the executive orders, and then they sign their own set of executive orders. And so you have this swing back and forth. When you have a coalition government that Ben was talking about, or people willing to come together for bipartisan or nonpartisan solutions, then you have the sustainability and the predictability of that policy. When you don't have any compromise on the system, you do end up drawing these big lines in the sand to where one side says, this is what we're going to do when we get in control. We don't care what the other side says. And then if they get control, they do. But if they lose control years later, it all gets reversed. And so Ben comes from he comes from a human service background. I come from a business background. I can say, at least traditionally from the business background, businesses need certainty and predictability as they're deciding capital investments, and they don't like to see these big swings in the government. I mean, it is true that there's too much money, and I never used to be in favor of public financing, but I see that maybe as a solution to not having all this money that gets dumped in to the system. That might not be the only way to solve it. There might be other ways, but people don't really, they talk about issues, but then they never sit down and try to solve them. And that's the hard part of public policy. The campaigning stuff does go on, as Ben said, and we never get a break from it. I mean, you get a break for school. There's a reason there's a summer vacation and spring break and holiday break. to get away and to recharge your batteries. That's why we have vacations and paid time off. But politics, it never stops. And to Ben's point, last week, a lady by the name of Nikki Haley was in town, and she's a former governor of South Carolina. She's also a former ambassador to the United Nations, and she was in town campaigning for her candidate. And the first question they asked her wasn't anything about the candidate that she was supporting. First question they asked her, are you going to run in 2024? I mean, we're not even done with this election, to Ben's point, and we're already on to the 2024 election. And with the 24-hour media cycle, there was this cartoon I used to watch when I was a kid. I can't remember what the name of it was, but it was a sheepdog and a coyote, and they basically come to work and they both punch in the clock. One guy's name was Ralph. I can't remember what the other guy's name was. And then the whole cartoon was them fighting each other as the coyote's trying to steal the sheep and he's trying to protect the sheep. And then somehow the whistle blows at 5 and they both walk out, and they're walking out as friends. So they did that battle when they were supposed to, but then after work, they got together. And because of the 24-hour nature of stuff, I don't think legislators at the state or the federal level, really know each other. They don't punch out and go out for dinner and learn about their families and their backgrounds and stuff. They keep fighting, just in a different venue on the TV stations.
Do you have any questions that are coming up before I keep moving?
Or observations about like what we're saying or the ads that you're experiencing, or if you're close to voting age, how it's been impacting you, or... Okay.
So you mentioned it's really difficult to compromise. There's some punishments. I'm sure when you were Speaker of the House, you were trying to keep your party folks voting the same way. But what's different now? What tools or punishments or weapons do they have now that you didn't have that makes it so you can't compromise?
So I'd say two things. One, there's more money in the system, and it's consolidated with a few people. So as Speaker of the House, you would know Nancy Pelosi's name. A lot of people give her money, and then she gives it to her candidates, and then they feel obligated to her. That is a way of consolidating your power. And then the retribution issue, I think, is probably one that isn't really talked about very much. Now, as mayor of Cedar Rapids, that's a nonpartisan race. You don't run as a Republican mayor or the Democrat mayor. It's no party. But people knew that I was a Republican. And so in general, over the years and years, people have certain expectation of Republicans. They have certain expectations of Democrats. And this was right after the flood. And our community was struggling to rebuild. It was also at the beginning of the 2008 recession, and companies like Rockwell were laying off. They laid off 10% of their workforce. So we had all this construction work to do in our community. And one of the things that I think most people would think is, well, if we can get our local companies and our local carpenters and electricians to do all that work, that would be a good thing. Local people working the job, sense of pride. They drive by and people say, hey, my mom or dad worked on that library project, or that, the cell center project, or any of the other things that needed to be done. But because of bidding laws in the state of Iowa, you're required to take the lowest bidder, even if that lowest bidder is out of Chicago. So as mayor, I want the taxpayer to get the lowest price to rebuild the library. But also as mayor, I don't want the out-of-state company coming in and bringing all the out-of-state workers while our carpenters and electricians are sitting unemployed. So we came up with an idea that would keep the low bid system so it wouldn't violate the state aid or state laws. But if a company from outside had to hire 100 carpenters, and if there were 100 unemployed carpenters, they had to hire those. If there were 30 unemployed, they had to hire those, then they could bring in. So it's called a project labor agreement. It's a terminology. And I thought that was a good idea. It struck a good balance of protecting the taxpayers so we didn't have runaway costs rebuilding the library in different places, but we also had local labor and people spending those paychecks, because having those people go back to Chicago on the weekend, or the company that is from Chicago, they don't give to United Way or don't give to Big or other places like that. So we really thought that was a good idea, but at the time the governor didn't, and he thought that was very anti-Republican for me to work with labor. Labor traditionally, if you think of unions and labor, well, they're on the Democrat side of the equation, that you, as a Republican, you don't do that type of stuff. Well, again, I'm a Republican, but I wasn't the Republican mayor. I was the nonpartisan mayor. And that did a lot of damage relationship-wise with me and the governor. And I really wonder if, once you have personal, disagreements with people, it can seep into other things. And the reason I question, I know this is all being reported and stuff, it's because a few years later we got a piece of legislation passed from the state that was going to have the state put in some money to help build the flood construction. And I asked the governor if he'd come over to Cedar Rapids and have a special bill signing, because the bill meant so much to our community. And they just had a non-discreet bill signing ceremony in Des Moines where nobody was invited. And I look back at that and I think, I wonder if that was a residual of that event that happened earlier with that labor agreement.
So talk about, it seems that county and city government, that more things get done. There's far less arguing. Like you said, you were able to strike a really reasonable balance. How is that? Is there a fear that what's going on above state and national is going to trickle down? Or is this a different animal? Because you ran as a nonpartisan, you don't have to, try not to have to play the political game as much? Just interested in that.
I mean, I think it's a delicate balance, and democracy by itself is an experiment. It just so happens it's been successful for 250 years, and there's nothing to say that local politics doesn't or will never get ugly. It's just you have to, I think, by nature, be more civil. You're closer to the people you represent. You're exponentially more accessible to them versus like someone in Congress who splits their time between a massive district and being in Washington. And you see them when they come into an event, then they're out. But Ron and I are at the grocery stores. We pump gas at the same places. We go out and people will come and talk to us. I shared this with the other group. The weirdest experience I've ever had, almost in my life, but certainly as an elected official, was right after I got elected. I was at the MAC gym, locker room, getting changed, about to go lift. This guy came over to me dressed in flip-flops. That's it. Standing as close to me as Trace, Dr. Pickering, and wanted to have a political conversation. I don't know what that has to do with anything. All I'm saying is that guy felt really comfortable coming up to an elected official and wanting to speak his mind. But that's not a rarity. It happens all the time. Well, at least the nakedness is, but the coming up to us, calling us is not rare, because you are so accessible and people expect at the local level that you set those things aside so that you can deal with mental health, or you can deal with making sure that people who work here get to enjoy higher wages or work on projects. So the expectation is different. I don't think that we could operate like people do in DC and expect to get elected. And maybe there is a constituency for that, but I think what you lose is your credibility. It might play well for some people, but you really lose, I think, your credibility. And in this community, at least, that's not what people want from their elected local leaders. And so the expectation is that.
I think there's been a loss of boundaries, too, for what people say to each other, and maybe specifically how they say it. And it's a lot harder to, do something in person, tell someone to their face.
Not that guy in the locker room.
You're a complete idiot, or whatever they're going to say to them. When you're behind your your computer or your device, where you can go out and say stuff. Sometimes you're not accountable, for that. So I've seen that escalate, in the years, and what people say about their elected officials. And in some ways, I don't really blame citizens for that. I almost blame the elected officials themselves, because what impression does the elected official themselves give when all they're doing is criticizing the other person and running them down? They're giving the general impression that they're all corrupt, right? They're all corrupt, they're all taking money from the side, under the table, they're all part of the system. So what ends up happening is the elected officials themselves plant the seeds of distrust in our government systems, to where, we hate Washington, D.C., right? What happened to Joni Ernst? She was going to represent us, and what did she do? She turned all D.C. on us. D.C.'s bad. D.C.'s a negative place. Look, Teresa Greenfield the same way. Well, she's going to be part of Pelosi and Schumer's D.C. gang, the squad. And so we demonize D.C., or we demonize Des Moines, that people have lost their trust in the basic institution, and then that flows into other institutions too. So I really worry about that, long term, for our country. And I really worry about, let's sit down and talk about an issue of sustainable, energy and the benefits of wind, but some of the challenges of wind. I would think most people don't know, how long does a blade last on one of the windmills? It lasts 10 years. It's made of fiberglass, 2,000 tons each blade. So every 10 years, there's 6,000 tons of fiberglass that has to be ground up and disposed of someplace. There's so many issues about everything, but we never talk about them because we try to simplify and says, well, this person's for renewable energy and this person isn't.
So to wrap this up, what can we do as ordinary, everyday citizens to begin to move back to something we used to have, in terms of, yes, we can have disagreements, we can argue, but we can come together and find a compromise, a third direction solution? What can we do to help with this?
Like I said a little bit earlier at the top, I'm really guided by a quote that's decisions are made by those who show up, and that's not just voting. I mean, that's sort of also taking into account some of your other civic responsibilities, and that includes being part of a process so that people who look like you also represent you, and it's not people who are in their 80s who are constantly in office. And having a certain level of awareness. It's a participatory democracy. You have to want it as much as elected leaders want you to be in it. And that means you have to have some level of awareness. I know with your agility training, you talk about stage 1 awareness, is that sort of like unaware, and then you move up through awareness. So being aware that you do play a role is key. And I mean, that's not the most sage advice. It might sound trite, but it's sort of guided me, and I think that as a society we'd be so much further along if people really recognize that decisions are made by those who truly show up, and that it's important to be aware of the issues.
And citizen involvement in general, and oftentimes historically people look to the government to solve the issue, and as the governments either refuse or can't, citizens still want those issues solved. So I think you'll see more citizen groups that get together outside of the political traditional circles to try and solve problems going forward.
Final questions?
Yes.
How do you go about having productive conversations with people who disagree with you on issues you feel strongly about?
So how do we have productive conversations?
With people who are vehemently opposed to your viewpoint?
It's an art. It's a skill that you have to build. No one. It's not something that you. Like Ron said, he was 25. I was 28. I had never held a political office a day in my life. Ron was 25. It's a skill set that you learn. And that oftentimes when people, if you're an elected official and people are upset, oftentimes they have had to jump through a number of hoops before they get to you, or that their issue hasn't been solved. And so a lot of it is, number one, you in this business, you build a tough skin. Number two, you still have compassion for people and their problems. And number three, you listen. You may be telling the person no, but it really is in how you approach telling them no and why you're telling them no. And that in and of itself is a skill set. It's very easy to retreat and just yell and scream. It's a lot harder to be deliberative and compassionate and understanding that this person's their problems are real to them and important to them. Might not be for you. And we get a lot of these calls all the time where it's like, you're calling me because the road outside of your house hasn't been plowed. Like, what? Do you want me to get a shovel myself? But for that person, it's real, and it's they're coming to you. So it's to answer your question, it's a skill set that you have to sort of develop and nurture, and it really is all how you maybe giving someone some bad news or information that they don't want, but it's a skill set that's developed.
Sometimes it also, depends on the situation and the person. If you're going to come up to me and you have two people having a camera on me and you, I'm going to be a little defensive, thinking that you're going to try to make a scene out of this discussion. I try to listen to people and hear what they're saying, and then try to engage them a little bit more on their points, and not always just try to argue against them. We can agree to disagree, but we don't have to be disagreeable when we're going after each other. And everybody's got a point of view, and it's valid to hear that. I represented everybody as mayor of Cedar Rapids, and everybody deserves an opinion. And I think if you give people time, that's also important. So I would go to events and I'd be the last one to leave a lot of times, making sure everybody had a chance to share their opinion. And those are a lot of people that didn't vote for me and say, well, I don't like every decision that you've made, but I like some of the decisions. And you're never going to agree 100% of the time. You have disagreements with your parents. You get married one of these days, you're going to have disagreement with your mate. It's just natural, but we don't have to be disagreeable as we disagree.
And I've, just to tie a bow on this, I have failed miserably in this job, keeping my cool sometimes. It is really tough when people come at you to just sort of take it in stride. And I've fired off, emails where I'm going to show you how smart I am and what I know, and not my finest. So that's why it's a skill.
Never ends well, does it?
I never get the last word.
Right.
And then you feel dumb afterwards, like, yeah, maybe I proved a point, but at what cost? And so it's a skill set. It's really tough. Standing next to someone that maybe you're diametrically opposed to, or someone that isn't coming at it with logic and reason, but pure emotion, and you have to kind of say, so admitting that it's difficult, and just knowing that oftentimes it's what we try and tell children, like, listen, don't interrupt. Everyone has a right to their opinions, but not to the facts. So.
All right, we'll wrap this up. Again, we thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Service.
Appreciate it.
Give these guys a good hand.